December 18, 1944. University of Zurich, Switzerland. Morris Mo Berg sat in the back row of a lecture hall in neutral Switzerland, listening to one of the world's greatest physicists explain the principles of quantum mechanics to an audience of Swiss scientists and academics. Berg appeared to be just another attendee at this prestigious scientific lecture, a well-dressed gentleman with an intellectual bearing, taking notes, nodding along with the presentation. But Berg was not a physicist. He was not Swiss. And he was not at this lecture to learn about quantum mechanics. Berg was an American spy working for the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, America's wartime intelligence agency. His mission tonight was singular and critical: determine whether Nazi Germany was close to developing an atomic bomb, and if the physicist on the lecture platform, Werner Heisenberg, indicated that Germany was on the verge of creating a nuclear weapon that could win the war, Berg had orders to kill him. In Berg's coat pocket was a pistol. In his mind was enough knowledge of nuclear physics to recognize whether Heisenberg's lecture contained hints about German atomic bomb progress. And in his character was the determination to commit murder in a crowded lecture hall in neutral territory if that murder might prevent Nazi Germany from obtaining the ultimate weapon. This was Berg's reality on this December night in 1944. Former Major League Baseball catcher, Princeton graduate, polyglot, who spoke a dozen languages, eccentric intellectual who had spent 15 years playing professional baseball, despite being possibly the most educated man in the sport, now sitting with a gun in his pocket, preparing to potentially assassinate one of history's greatest scientists. The lecture proceeded. Heisenberg discussed S-matrix theory, theoretical physics far removed from weapons applications. Berg listened intently, analyzing not just what Heisenberg said, but what he didn't say, how he said it, whether his demeanor suggested confidence in German weapons programs or academic discussion divorced from military urgency. Berg had spent months preparing for this moment. He had studied nuclear physics with American scientists who were building the atomic bomb at Los Alamos. He had learned enough to understand the technical challenges of creating fission weapons, to recognize whether a physicist's discussion indicated practical weapons work or purely theoretical research. He had been briefed on what signs to look for, what questions to ask if he had opportunity, what conclusions to draw from Heisenberg's words and behavior. And he had accepted that if Heisenberg indicated German nuclear weapons were imminent, Berg would have to kill him, shoot him during the lecture, accept certain capture or death, but eliminate the scientist who could give Hitler atomic bombs that would devastate Allied cities and potentially change the war's outcome. But as the lecture proceeded, as Berg listened and analyzed, he became increasingly convinced that Germany was not close to nuclear weapons. Heisenberg's discussion was theoretical, academic, divorced from urgent weapons development. His demeanor was that of a professor discussing abstract physics, not of a scientist racing to build civilization-destroying weapons. The signs Berg had been trained to recognize weren't there. When the lecture ended, Berg attended the reception afterward, positioned himself to overhear Heisenberg's conversations, listened for any indication that the lecture had been deliberately misleading, that Heisenberg was concealing German weapons progress. He heard nothing alarming, just a scientist discussing physics with colleagues, talking about theoretical problems, showing no urgency or secrecy that would indicate weapons work. Berg left the reception convinced that Germany was not on the verge of atomic weapons, that Heisenberg was not leading a crash program to give Hitler nuclear bombs, that assassination was not necessary. He filed his report with OSS. German nuclear weapons were not imminent. Heisenberg could live. This assessment, made by a former baseball player with no formal scientific training, beyond what he had crammed in preparation for this mission, was correct. Germany's atomic bomb program was years behind the Manhattan Project, would never produce weapons, posed no threat to the Allies. Berg's judgment, made under extraordinary pressure in a situation where error could have catastrophic consequences, was accurate. The bizarre journey that brought Moe Berg from Major League Baseball to a lecture hall in Switzerland with a pistol and assassination orders is one of World War II's strangest and most fascinating stories. It's the story of a man who never quite fit anywhere, too intellectual for baseball, too athletic for academia, too secretive for normal human relationships, but who found in wartime espionage a role that matched his unique combination of intelligence, languages, nerve, and willingness to operate in moral gray areas. This is the story of Morris Moe Berg, the catcher who became a spy, the Princeton graduate who spent 15 years in professional baseball while reading philosophy and learning languages, the man who was possibly the strangest person ever to play Major League Baseball and who became possibly the most interesting spy in OSS service. This is the story of how an eccentric baseball player became a secret agent, how he gathered intelligence across Europe in preparation for D-Day, how he was sent to assassinate Werner Heisenberg if necessary, and how after the war he became even more mysterious, living as an unemployed enigma supported by friends who couldn't understand him, but recognized his brilliance. To understand how Moe Berg became a spy, we need to understand who he was before the war, because Berg was unusual long before he joined OSS, and his espionage career was in many ways the logical culmination of a life spent being different from everyone around him. Morris Berg was born on March 2, 1902, in New York City to Jewish immigrants from Ukraine. His father Bernard was a pharmacist who had immigrated to escape persecution, who worked hard to establish himself in America, and who wanted his children to be educated professionals rather than working-class laborers. Moe was the youngest of 3 children, and from early childhood showed exceptional intellectual abilities. He was reading by age 3, learning multiple languages while in elementary school, demonstrating the kind of intellectual precociousness that marked him as unusual even in his academically oriented Jewish immigrant community. But Moe was also athletic, which was less common among the bookish children of Jewish immigrants in early 20th century New York. He excelled at baseball, showing natural talent that made him stand out in neighborhood games. By high school, Moe was recognized as both an exceptional student and an exceptional baseball player, a combination that was unusual then and remains unusual today. Moe attended Princeton University on a scholarship, arriving in 1919. Princeton in this era was an elite institution dominated by wealthy Protestant students. Jewish students were rare. Scholarship students were viewed as inferior to those paying full tuition, and someone from Moe's background was very much an outsider in Princeton's social hierarchy. Berg dealt with this marginalization by excelling at everything. He studied linguistics and modern languages, becoming fluent in French, German, Spanish, Italian, Japanese, and several other languages. He studied Latin and ancient Greek. He read philosophy, literature, and history voraciously. He was one of the best students in his class academically, but he also played baseball for Princeton, becoming the team's starting catcher and one of the best college baseball players in the country. This combination, intellectual excellence and athletic achievement, was so rare that Berg became famous at Princeton as the scholarly athlete, the linguistic genius who also caught for the baseball team. After graduating from Princeton in 1923, Berg faced a choice that would define his life. His father wanted him to become a lawyer, to use his Princeton education to enter a prestigious profession. Professional baseball teams wanted to sign him, seeing his talent as worth developing, despite his being 21 and already old for a baseball prospect. Berg chose baseball, but did so in a way that maintained his intellectual identity. He signed with the Brooklyn Dodgers for the 1923 season, but also enrolled at Columbia Law School, attending law classes during the day and playing minor league baseball in the evenings and on weekends. This schedule was exhausting and probably impossible, but Berg maintained it, unwilling to choose between intellectual and athletic pursuits. Eventually, the demands forced a choice. Berg couldn't simultaneously be a full-time law student and a professional baseball player. He chose baseball, leaving law school after 1 year, but he never fully abandoned his intellectual identity. Throughout his 15-year professional baseball career, 1923 to 1939, Berg remained an intellectual anomaly in a sport that didn't particularly value education or cultural sophistication. Berg played for several teams: Brooklyn Dodgers, Chicago White Sox, Cleveland Indians, Washington Senators, Boston Red Sox, primarily as a backup catcher. He was never a star player. His batting average was mediocre, or .243 lifetime. His defensive skills were solid but not exceptional, and he spent most of his career as a second-string catcher who played when the starter needed rest. But Berg's intelligence and language skills made him valuable in other ways. He became known as the smartest player in baseball, the man who could speak a dozen languages, who read serious literature in the dugout, who could discuss philosophy with sports writers. Stories about Berg's intellectual eccentricity became legendary in baseball circles. One famous story, possibly apocryphal but widely told, had a sports writer asking Berg's White Sox teammate Ted Lyons about Berg's intelligence. Lyons supposedly replied, "Mo Berg is the strangest man in baseball. He speaks a dozen languages and can't hit in any of them." This quote, whether authentic or invented, captured how Berg was perceived: brilliant but strange, intellectual but not particularly successful at his ostensible profession, someone who was in baseball but not quite of baseball. Berg's teammates found him fascinating, but couldn't quite relate to him. He would read newspapers in foreign languages during train trips. He would visit museums and libraries in cities where the team played instead of socializing with teammates. He never married, never seemed to have romantic relationships, maintained an emotional distance from everyone that suggested deep loneliness or possibly just preference for solitude. But Berg's intelligence and education, which made him odd among ballplayers, also opened opportunities that typical baseball players wouldn't have. In 1932, Berg was invited to join a barnstorming tour of Japan, where American baseball players would play exhibition games against Japanese teams. This was a goodwill tour, designed to promote baseball in Japan and to build cultural connections between the United States and Japan. Berg jumped at the opportunity. He loved languages and had been studying Japanese for years. The chance to visit Japan, to practice the language, to experience the culture firsthand, was irresistible. He joined the tour and spent several months in Japan in late 1932 and early 1933. While in Japan, Berg did something that would become significant a decade later. He gathered information about Japanese military installations and took photographs of Tokyo's skyline and harbor facilities. Whether he did this at the request of U.S. intelligence services or on his own initiative remains unclear, but Berg returned from Japan with photographs and information that would later be used for bombing raid planning during World War II. This early intelligence gathering revealed something about Berg's character. He was comfortable operating in gray areas, comfortable gathering information surreptitiously, comfortable with secrecy and deception. These traits, unusual for a baseball player, would make him perfect for intelligence work. In 1934, Berg returned to Japan as part of another barnstorming tour, this one featuring Babe Ruth and other baseball stars. Again, Berg gathered photographs and information, this time more extensively. He visited areas that were off-limits to foreigners, photographed military installations, collected information that American intelligence would find valuable when war came. Berg's 1934 activities in Japan have been romanticized in some accounts, with claims that he single-handedly gathered crucial intelligence for the eventual bombing of Tokyo. The reality was more modest. He took photographs and gathered information that was later incorporated into bombing planning, but he wasn't conducting sophisticated espionage operations. He was a curious, observant person who happened to be in Japan, who spoke the language, who could go places that official intelligence gatherers couldn't, and who recognized that the information he gathered might be useful. But these Japanese trips established Berg as someone with intelligence potential. When World War II began, and the United States needed people who spoke foreign languages, who could operate in foreign cultures, who had demonstrated ability to gather information discreetly, Berg's name came to the attention of intelligence recruiters. In 1939, Berg retired from professional baseball at age 37. His playing career had been long but undistinguished. A lifetime, .243 batting average, no championships, no particular fame beyond being known as the intellectual oddity of baseball. He had earned decent money by 1930 standards, but had no clear career prospects after baseball. Berg spent the next few years in a kind of limbo, living with his brother in Newark, New Jersey, attending baseball games, reading voraciously, maintaining his language studies, but not working regularly. He had money saved from his playing career, but was essentially unemployed, living a mysterious existence that none of his friends or family quite understood. Then, in early 1942, several months after Pearl Harbor, Berg received a visit from someone representing Nelson Rockefeller's office of the Coordinator of Inter-American Affairs. The office was looking for people who spoke Spanish and Portuguese to work on programs promoting U.S. interests in Latin America. Berg, who spoke both languages fluently, was offered a position. Berg accepted and spent several months in 1942 traveling through Latin America on vague goodwill missions that involved giving lectures about baseball, building cultural connections, and probably gathering intelligence about pro-Axis sympathies in various Latin American countries. The work was not particularly demanding or dangerous, but it brought Berg into contact with U.S. intelligence community. In 1943, Berg was recruited by the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, the wartime intelligence agency run by William Wild Bill Donovan. OSS was looking for people with language skills, cultural knowledge, and ability to operate independently in foreign environments. Berg fit the profile perfectly. Berg was assigned to OSS's Research and Analysis Branch initially, working in Washington doing intelligence analysis related to Europe. But his language skills and his ability to blend in across cultures made him valuable for field operations. In late 1943, Berg was sent to Europe on his first significant intelligence mission. The mission involved traveling through Yugoslavia, where partisan forces under Tito were fighting German occupation. OSS wanted intelligence on the effectiveness of partisan operations, on Yugoslav willingness to continue fighting, on how American aid was being used. Berg, speaking Serbo-Croatian, which he had learned for this mission, traveled through partisan-held territory, gathered intelligence, and reported back to OSS. The Yugoslav mission demonstrated Berg's capabilities as a field operative. He could learn languages quickly enough to become functional in them within weeks. He could operate independently in dangerous environments without the support structures that most intelligence officers required. He was comfortable with ambiguity, with missions that had vague objectives and unclear success criteria, and he was absolutely secretive, never revealing more than necessary about what he was doing or what he had learned. These characteristics made Berg valuable for the kind of sensitive, independent operations that OSS specialized in. While many OSS operatives worked in teams or with extensive support, Berg operated best alone, pursuing objectives that were often more art than science, gathering information through observation and conversation rather than through technical means. In early 1944, Berg was given his most important and dangerous mission, joining the Alsos mission, a secret Allied operation to determine the status of German atomic bomb research and to prevent German scientists from falling into Soviet hands as the war ended. March 1944. Washington, D.C. Mo Berg sat in a classified briefing room at OSS headquarters, listening to some of America's most brilliant scientists explain the physics of nuclear fission and the race to build the atomic bomb. Around the table were physicists who understood quantum mechanics, nuclear chain reactions, and the engineering challenges of creating weapons that could destroy entire cities with a single explosion. Berg was not a physicist. His Princeton education had included no advanced science. He had spent the past 20 years playing baseball, not studying nuclear physics. But now he was being asked to understand enough about atomic weapons to assess whether Nazi Germany was close to building them, and if necessary, to kill the scientists who might give Hitler the bomb. The Alsos mission, which Berg was joining, was one of the most secret operations of World War II. Even its name was classified. Alsos was Greek for grove, a reference to General Leslie Groves, who commanded the Manhattan Project that was building America's atomic bomb. The mission had two primary objectives: determine the status of German atomic research and capture German scientists and materials before the Soviets could. The first objective was urgent because of fear. American scientists working on the Manhattan Project understood how devastating atomic weapons would be. If Germany developed atomic bombs before the Allies did, if Hitler could drop nuclear weapons on London, Moscow, or invading Allied armies, the war's outcome would be uncertain regardless of Allied advantages in conventional forces. This fear drove Allied intelligence to desperate measures. The scientific community knew that Germany had world-class physicists, had discovered nuclear fission in 1938, had access to the materials needed for atomic weapons. The question was whether German scientists were actually building bombs, or whether Germany's chaotic war economy and Hitler's scientific policies had prevented effective weapons development. Answering this question required technical intelligence that traditional spies couldn't gather. You couldn't simply steal German atomic bomb plans because the plans were too complex for non-scientists to understand or evaluate. You needed someone who could interact with German physicists, who could assess their work, who could recognize whether they were close to working weapons. This was where Berg came in. OSS had recognized that Berg's combination of language skills, cultural sophistication, scientific education, even if not at PhD level, and operational capability made him uniquely suited for technical intelligence missions. Berg could walk into scientific environments, could speak the languages, could understand enough physics to assess progress, and could operate independently without the support that most operatives required. The scientists briefing Berg in March 1944 faced a pedagogical challenge: how to teach a non-scientist enough nuclear physics to assess German bomb progress without spending years on education. The solution was an intensive crash course focusing on practical questions rather than theoretical understanding. Berg learned about nuclear chain reactions, how splitting uranium atoms could release energy that split more atoms, creating exponential energy release. He learned about critical mass, the minimum amount of fissile material needed to sustain a chain reaction. He learned about enrichment, the process of separating uranium-235, which could sustain chain reactions, from uranium-238, which couldn't. He learned about the practical challenges of building atomic bombs, the difficulty of enriching enough uranium, the precision required to assemble bomb components, the industrial infrastructure needed to produce weapons-grade material. Most importantly, he learned what signs would indicate that a nuclear program was at the weapons development stage versus stuck at basic research. Berg absorbed this information with the same intensity he had applied to learning languages. He might not understand the mathematics or theoretical physics at a PhD level, but he understood the practical questions. Was Germany enriching uranium? Had they achieved chain reactions? Were they working on bomb designs? Did they have the industrial capacity to produce weapons? The scientists were impressed by Berg's ability to grasp the essentials. He asked intelligent questions, focused on the practical intelligence needs rather than getting distracted by theoretical complexities, and demonstrated the kind of intuitive understanding that suggested he could assess German programs even without formal scientific training. By late spring 1944, Berg was ready for deployment to Europe as part of the ULSO's mission. His specific role was ambiguous, as was typical for Berg's assignments. He would operate as a special agent with broad authority to gather intelligence on German atomic research by whatever means seemed appropriate. He would work with ULSO's mission scientists and military personnel, but would also conduct independent operations when opportunities arose. Berg arrived in Europe in August 1944, shortly after D-Day, as Allied forces were breaking out of Normandy and advancing across France. The ULSO's mission was following closely behind advancing armies, reaching recently liberated areas to search for German scientists, laboratories, and documents before they could be destroyed or captured by Soviet forces advancing from the east. Berg's first significant operation was in France, investigating laboratories and universities where German scientists had worked on nuclear research. He spoke French fluently, could blend into academic environments, and was skilled at extracting information through casual conversations that subjects didn't recognize as interrogation. In Paris, recently liberated in August 1944, Berg visited laboratories, interviewed French scientists who had worked under German occupation, and gathered documents that the Germans hadn't had time to destroy when evacuating. The intelligence painted a picture of German nuclear research that was sophisticated theoretically, but far behind the Manhattan Project in practical weapons development. But the French intelligence was incomplete. The crucial German research was in Germany itself, in laboratories that Allied forces hadn't yet reached. The scientists who truly understood German bomb progress were still in Aufstand, German-controlled territory, or had fled as Allied forces advanced. This is where Werner Heisenberg became crucial. Heisenberg was one of the world's greatest physicists, winner of the 1932 Nobel Prize in Physics for his work on quantum mechanics, and before the war had been among the scientists whose work laid the foundation for understanding nuclear fission. During the war, Heisenberg had remained in Germany, had worked on nuclear research for the German government, and was believed to be leading or heavily involved in German atomic bomb efforts. If anyone knew whether Germany was close to atomic weapons, it was Heisenberg. And if Germany was close, if Heisenberg's work might give Hitler atomic bombs, then stopping Heisenberg became a strategic priority, regardless of how that stopping was accomplished. The order to assassinate Heisenberg, if necessary, came from the highest levels of the Manhattan Project and OSS. The reasoning was coldly logical. If Heisenberg's work might give Hitler atomic bombs that could kill millions and possibly win the war for Germany, then killing Heisenberg was justified. One man's life weighed against millions was an easy calculation in the utilitarian mathematics of total war. But executing the order would be difficult. Heisenberg was in Germany, which Allied forces hadn't reached yet. German security protected important scientists. Reaching Heisenberg would require penetrating German-controlled territory, identifying his location, getting close enough to kill him, and escaping afterward, all of which seemed nearly impossible. The opportunity came from an unexpected direction. In late 1944, Heisenberg was scheduled to give a lecture in Zurich, Switzerland, a neutral country where both Allied and Axis nationals could operate. Swiss authorities had invited Heisenberg to speak at the University of Zurich about theoretical physics, partly as an academic event and partly as Swiss diplomacy maintaining relationships with both sides of the war. OSS learned about the lecture through intelligence channels and immediately recognized the opportunity. Switzerland was neutral territory where Berg could operate. The lecture was in a university, a public setting where Berg's academic background would let him blend in naturally, and the lecture itself would provide intelligence. What Heisenberg discussed, how he discussed it, whether he showed signs of urgent weapons work or merely theoretical academic research. Berg was given the assignment in November 1944. He would travel to Switzerland, attend Heisenberg's lecture, assess whether German atomic weapons were imminent, and if they were, kill Heisenberg. The assessment would be Berg's alone. He would have no way to consult with superiors or scientists during the lecture. He would need to make a life-and-death decision based on his understanding of nuclear physics and his judgment of Heisenberg's presentation. This was an extraordinary amount of responsibility to place on someone who was not a physicist, who had no formal authority to order assassinations, who would be operating alone in a foreign country. But Berg's entire career had been preparation for exactly this kind of independent operation, requiring judgment, nerve, and acceptance of moral complexity. Berg prepared meticulously for the Zurich mission. He studied Heisenberg's pre-war scientific work, learning the physicist's research interests and theoretical approach. He reviewed everything Allied intelligence knew about German nuclear research, memorizing the names of scientists, laboratories, and programs. He studied the physics questions he should focus on during the lecture. Would Heisenberg discuss enrichment? Mention chain reactions? Show urgency that suggested weapons work rather than theoretical research? He also prepared for the assassination. He obtained a pistol, practiced with it to ensure he could shoot accurately. He studied the layout of the lecture hall, identifying where he would sit to have clear shot at the podium. He planned how he would escape after shooting Heisenberg, exit routes from the building, transportation options, safe houses where he could hide before attempting to cross back into Allied-controlled territory. The probability of escaping successfully after assassinating Heisenberg in a crowded lecture hall in neutral Switzerland was low. Swiss authorities would arrest him, German intelligence would demand his extradition. Even if Switzerland refused extradition, Berg would likely spend the rest of the war in Swiss detention. But the mission's importance justified the risk. If killing Heisenberg prevented Hitler from obtaining atomic bombs, Berg's capture or death would be acceptable cost. Berg traveled to Switzerland in early December 1944, using false documents that identified him as a Swiss businessman. He entered the country through France, crossing the border with the help of OSS contacts who facilitated intelligence operatives' movement through neutral territory. He settled in Zurich under his cover identity, established himself in a hotel, and prepared for the lecture on December 18th. During the days before the lecture, Berg conducted additional intelligence gathering. He met with Swiss scientists who knew Heisenberg, asking casual questions about the German physicist's work and demeanor. He visited the university to familiarize himself with the layout. He identified German intelligence operatives who were likely in Zurich to monitor or protect Heisenberg, noting their faces and patterns so he could avoid them. On December 18th, Berg attended the lecture. He dressed formally, as befitted an academic lecture. He carried his pistol in his coat pocket, loaded and ready. He brought a cyanide capsule, standard issue for OSS operatives on dangerous missions, to use if capture seemed inevitable and suicide seemed preferable to interrogation. The lecture hall was crowded with Swiss scientists, university faculty, and academics. Heisenberg was introduced and began his presentation on S-matrix theory, a topic in theoretical physics related to quantum mechanics. Berg listened intently, analyzing not just the content, but the presentation. Heisenberg's demeanor, his confidence, his focus. What Berg observed was a scientist discussing theoretical physics, not a weapons engineer urgently developing bombs. Heisenberg's presentation was academic, speculative, concerned with fundamental questions rather than practical applications. There was no urgency, no secrecy, no suggestion that he was leading a crash program to build weapons that would change the war. Berg's hand stayed out of his pocket. The pistol remained unused. Heisenberg continued his lecture, unaware that a man in the audience had been prepared to kill him if his words had suggested different conclusions. After the lecture, Berg attended the reception, positioning himself to observe and overhear Heisenberg's conversations. He spoke with several Swiss scientists, asking oblique questions about German research, German morale, whether German scientists believed Germany could still win the war. The responses confirmed Berg's assessment. German scientists were demoralized. German research was stalled. There was no indication of breakthrough weapons development. Berg also managed a brief conversation with Heisenberg himself. Using his fluent German, Berg introduced himself as a Swiss physics enthusiast, asked a question about the lecture, and observed Heisenberg's response. The physicist was polite, academic, showed no signs of someone under pressure from urgent weapons work, no hint that he was concealing major secrets. After the reception, Berg filed his report to OSS headquarters via encrypted communication channels. German atomic weapons were not imminent. Heisenberg was not leading a crash bomb program. The threat that German nuclear weapons would affect the war's outcome was minimal. Assassination was not necessary. This assessment was correct. Post-war investigation revealed that Germany's nuclear program, while theoretically sophisticated, had never come close to weapons development. German scientists had achieved nuclear chain reactions, but hadn't progressed to bomb design or enrichment at weapons scale. Various factors, Allied bombing, resource shortages, Hitler's scientific policies, mistakes by German scientists, had prevented Germany from developing the bomb. But Berg couldn't have known with certainty that his assessment was correct. He was making a judgment call based on incomplete information, on his observation of one lecture and one reception, on his intuitive sense of whether Heisenberg showed urgency that would indicate weapons work. He could have been wrong. Heisenberg could have been concealing German bomb progress. The lecture could have been deliberately misleading. If Berg had been wrong, if German atomic weapons had devastated Allied cities weeks or months later, Berg would have been responsible for failing to eliminate the threat when he had the opportunity. The weight of that potential responsibility, millions of lives hanging on whether he correctly interpreted a physics lecture, was enormous. But Berg trusted his judgment, filed his report, and did not shoot Heisenberg. It was the most consequential decision of his espionage career, made alone in a foreign country with no ability to consult superiors, based on his assessment of a situation that no amount of training could fully prepare him for. After the Zurich mission, Berg continued working for the Alsos mission through the winter and spring of 1945. As Allied forces advanced into Germany, Berg followed, interrogating captured German scientists, searching laboratories for documents and equipment, gathering intelligence on German nuclear programs. In April 1945, Berg was part of the team that located and secured uranium ore and heavy water that Germany had hidden to prevent Allied capture. This material represented Germany's nuclear program's physical assets. Without it, any remaining German nuclear research was purely theoretical. Capturing the material ensured that even if German scientists wanted to continue nuclear research, they lacked the basic materials to do so. Berg also participated in interrogating captured German scientists, including eventually interviewing Werner Heisenberg after he was captured by Allied forces in May 1945. The irony was striking. Berg, who had been prepared to assassinate Heisenberg 5 months earlier, now sat across from him conducting friendly interrogation about German nuclear research. Heisenberg in captivity was cooperative, explaining German nuclear research in detail, acknowledging that Germany had never come close to atomic bombs, attributing this to various technical and organizational failures. Heisenberg's post-war accounts of German nuclear research were self-serving. He claimed that German scientists had deliberately slowed weapons development because they didn't want Hitler to have atomic bombs, a claim that historians have largely rejected as post hoc rationalization. But regardless of whether German scientists had deliberately sabotaged their bomb program or had simply failed despite trying, the result was clear. Germany had never threatened to develop atomic weapons. Berg's assessment in Zurich had been correct. Heisenberg had lived, and his living had not endangered the Allied cause. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, Berg's primary mission was complete. German nuclear research had been captured. German scientists were in Allied custody. The threat that Germany might develop atomic weapons was eliminated. But Berg's work wasn't finished. The Alsos mission's second objective was preventing Soviet capture of German scientists and materials, and this objective became more urgent as wartime cooperation between Western allies and the Soviet Union deteriorated into post-war hostility. Through summer and fall 1945, Berg worked in occupied Germany, helping to organize the movement of German scientists to America and Britain, ensuring that German nuclear research materials were secured by Western allies rather than the Soviets, and generally contributing to what would become the early phases of the Cold War's scientific competition. But Berg's contribution to the Alsos mission and to the larger war effort was already complete. He had assessed German nuclear programs correctly. had helped secure German scientists and materials, had contributed to ensuring that atomic weapons remained an Allied monopoly rather than becoming a technology that could spread to enemies or potential enemies. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, ending the Pacific War, were American weapons that Germany and Japan had failed to develop. Berg had played a small but significant role in ensuring that outcome. By confirming that Germany wasn't close to atomic weapons, he had reassured Allied leadership that the Manhattan Project had a decisive lead, that resources devoted to the bomb were well spent, that the nuclear arms race had been won before it really began. For this work, Berg was awarded the Medal of Freedom, the civilian equivalent of the Medal of Honor, by President Truman in October 1945. But in characteristic fashion, Berg declined the award. He refused to accept it, never explained publicly why, and left the medal unclaimed in an OSS office. Berg's refusal of recognition was consistent with his lifelong pattern of rejecting acclaim, maintaining secrecy, and resisting any attempt to define or categorize him. He had completed his mission, had contributed to victory, and didn't need or want public recognition for it. But this refusal also marked the beginning of Berg's tragic post-war decline. The war had given Berg purpose, had matched his unusual skills to important work, had allowed him to be strange and secretive and independent while still being valuable. Peace removed that purpose, and Berg spent the last 27 years of his life increasingly isolated, unemployed, and mysterious. After declining the Medal of Freedom, Berg formally separated from OSS, which was disbanded in September 1945, and returned to civilian life. But what civilian life meant for Berg was unclear. He had no career, no family, no obvious path forward. He was 43 years old, had spent 15 years playing baseball and 3 years as a spy, and had no idea what to do next. Berg tried various endeavors in the late 1940s. He worked briefly for NATO, doing vague consulting related to his intelligence experience. He considered writing a book about his wartime service, but couldn't bring himself to reveal the secrets he had kept. He maintained contact with former OSS colleagues, occasionally helping with projects that required language skills or cultural knowledge. But increasingly, Berg became a figure of mystery and decline. He lived with his brother in Newark, unemployed, reading constantly, attending baseball games, maintaining his language studies, but not working regularly or pursuing any coherent career. He had money from his baseball earnings and from investments, enough to live modestly, but he had no purpose beyond existing. Friends and family tried to understand Berg, to help him find direction. But Berg resisted all attempts to explain himself or to fit into conventional patterns. He was asked repeatedly why he didn't marry, why he didn't work, what he did with his time. His responses were evasive or silent. He maintained emotional distance from everyone, even those closest to him. 1950s, 1970s. Newark, New Jersey, and various locations. Morris Berg spent the final decades of his life as an enigma wrapped in mystery, living with his brother Samuel in a small apartment, unemployed, reading newspapers in a dozen languages, attending baseball games where he was occasionally recognized by fans who remembered him from his playing days, and maintaining a network of friendships with people who supported him financially and emotionally, despite not understanding him. This period of Berg's life is simultaneously the most documented, because friends and acquaintances wrote extensively about their encounters with him, and the most mysterious, because Berg himself revealed almost nothing about his inner life, his thoughts, or his reasons for living as he did. Berg's daily routine in these years followed a pattern that seemed designed to fill time without actually accomplishing anything. He would wake late, read newspapers obsessively. He insisted on reading multiple newspapers from different cities, in different languages, each day. Walk to the local library where he would spend hours reading, attend baseball games when possible, and return home to read more before sleeping. He maintained correspondence with former teammates, former OSS colleagues, friends from Princeton, and various acquaintances from his multi-layered past. The letters he wrote were witty, intellectually sophisticated, full of references to literature and history, but revealed nothing personal. Berg used language as a shield, keeping people at distance through elaborate verbal performance that seemed intimate, but actually disclosed nothing important. Friends who tried to help Berg find employment discovered that he had no interest in conventional work. He was offered teaching positions at universities based on his languages and his Princeton degree. He declined. He was offered consulting work related to baseball, leveraging his fame and knowledge of the sport. He declined. He was offered intelligence work during the early Cold War, when his OSS experience would have been valuable. He declined. Berg seemed to prefer unemployment and marginal existence to the compromises that regular work would require. Or perhaps he simply couldn't function in normal professional environments, having spent his life being too strange for baseball and too athletic for academia, having finally found purpose during wartime intelligence work that peacetime couldn't replicate. His refusal of the Medal of Freedom in 1945 became emblematic of Berg's post-war life. When friends asked why he had refused the award, Berg gave evasive answers or no answers at all. Some speculated that he believed his wartime work hadn't merited special recognition. Others thought he was too modest to accept honors. Still others believed that accepting the medal would have required explaining what he had done during the war, revealing secrets he was committed to keeping, and Berg valued secrecy more than recognition. The most insightful interpretation came from Berg's Princeton classmate and lifelong friend, who suggested that Berg refused the medal because accepting it would have meant being defined by his wartime service, being categorized as Moe Berg the spy, rather than being the undefined mystery he preferred to remain. Berg resisted all attempts to be defined, explained, or categorized. Refusing the Medal of Freedom was consistent with a lifetime of refusing to be pinned down. But this resistance to definition, while intellectually principled, made Berg's life increasingly difficult. He needed money to live but wouldn't work for it in conventional ways. He relied on financial support from his brother Samuel, who loved Moe, but was frustrated by his refusal to support himself. He borrowed money from friends, often without clear plans to repay it, creating tensions in relationships. One friend, a former OSS colleague who became wealthy after the war, essentially supported Berg for years, paying his expenses, buying him clothes when he's worn out, providing money for baseball games and books. When asked why he supported someone who wouldn't work, the friend replied, "Because Berg is a genius, and geniuses shouldn't have to worry about mundane things like earning a living." This romanticized view of Berg, as a genius too brilliant and unusual to function in normal society, was common among those who knew him. Berg encouraged this view through his intellectual performances, his language abilities, his breadth of knowledge. But it also enabled Berg's dysfunction, allowed him to avoid adult responsibilities, let him remain dependent and marginal rather than finding productive outlets for his abilities. Berg's relationship with his family was complex and often strained. His brother Samuel loved him but was exhausted by supporting him financially and emotionally. His sister Ethel maintained contact but found Moe's secretiveness and refusal to live normally frustrating, His father Bernard, who had wanted Mo to become a lawyer, had died disappointed that his brilliant son had spent 15 years playing baseball and then had declined into unemployment. Berg never married, never had children, and his sexuality was a source of speculation among those who knew him. Some friends believed Berg was gay, but deeply closeted, unable to acknowledge his sexuality because of his era's homophobia and his family's expectations. Others believed Berg was asexual, simply uninterested in romantic or sexual relationships. Still others thought Berg was heterosexual but too emotionally damaged or isolated to form intimate relationships. Berg himself never addressed the question, never discussed relationships or sexuality, maintained absolute privacy about his personal life. When friends asked why he had never married, Berg would deflect with jokes or literary references, never giving real answers. The most poignant interpretation is that Berg was profoundly lonely, that his intelligence and strangeness isolated him, that he desperately wanted connection but didn't know how to achieve it, and that his secrecy and emotional distance were protective mechanisms developed over decades of being different from everyone around him. During the 1960s, as Berg aged into his 60s, his situation became more precarious. His brother Samuel wanted to retire, to stop supporting Mo, to have his own life. Berg's savings from his baseball career were depleted. His network of friends who supported him financially was aging, and some were dying. Berg occasionally worked during this period, taking temporary positions that required his language skills or his intelligence background. But he never held any position long, would quit or be fired after weeks or months, returning to unemployment and dependence on others. One job Berg took in the mid-1960s was with a foundation that supported international student exchanges. Berg's role was to interview foreign students, assess their backgrounds, and help facilitate their studies in America. The work matched Berg's skills, languages, cultural knowledge, ability to connect with people from different backgrounds. But Berg was fired after 6 months. His supervisors found him brilliant but unreliable. He would miss meetings, would disappear for days without explanation, would complete work in brilliant bursts separated by long periods of inactivity. He couldn't or wouldn't conform to basic professional expectations about showing up and doing consistent work. Throughout these years, Berg maintained his connection to baseball, attending games at Yankee Stadium, Shea Stadium, and other venues when he could afford tickets, or when friends bought them for him. Baseball had been the one constant in Berg's life. He had played professionally for 15 years, had followed the sport obsessively since childhood, knew its history and statistics with encyclopedic thoroughness. At games, Berg was occasionally recognized by fans who remembered him from his playing days. Some would approach to talk about baseball, to share memories of games they had seen Berg play 30 or 40 years earlier. Berg was gracious with these encounters, would discuss baseball with enthusiasm and knowledge, but would never discuss his personal life or what he had done since retiring from the WWII sport. One recurring story from this period involved Berg being asked by a young fan what he had done after baseball. Berg's response, which became almost a catchphrase among those who knew him, was, "I've been in the intelligence business." But Berg said it with such dry humor, with such deadpan delivery, that people couldn't tell if he was joking or serious. The ambiguity was intentional. Berg revealed and concealed simultaneously, told the truth while making it sound like a joke. In the late 1960s, several journalists and writers became interested in Berg's wartime service as information about OSS operations began to be declassified. They approached Berg for interviews offered to help him write memoirs, suggested that his story deserved to be told. Berg refused all of these approaches. He would not discuss his OSS work, would not provide details about his missions, would not confirm or deny specific stories about his wartime activities. When pressed, Berg would say that he had taken an oath of secrecy, that he couldn't discuss classified information, that his work was personal and not for public consumption. This secrecy was partly about security. Even decades after the war, some information remained classified, but it was also about identity. Berg's wartime service had been the period when he felt most purposeful, most valuable, most himself. Sharing those experiences publicly, turning them into stories for others' entertainment, would have cheapened them in Berg's view. The experiences were his, private, not to be commodified or explained. But Berg's refusal to discuss his past also meant that his most significant accomplishments remained unknown. While his contemporaries who had served in conventional military roles or in civilian wartime work could speak about their service, could be recognized and honored for what they had done, Berg remained silent and consequently unrecognized for work that had been more important than most people's wartime contributions. In 1972, at age 70, Berg's health began deteriorating. He had various ailments related to age and to decades of living marginally: poor nutrition, inadequate medical care, the stress of financial precarity. He was hospitalized several times for relatively minor conditions that became serious because he had neglected them. Berg's financial situation was desperate by this time. Samuel had died, ending the primary source of support Berg had relied on for decades. The friends who had supported Berg financially were mostly dead or no longer in contact. Berg was essentially destitute, living on minimal savings and occasional help from remaining friends. One friend, learning of Berg's situation, arranged for Berg to finally accept the Medal of Freedom that had been offered in 1945 and that Berg had initially refused. The medal had sat unclaimed in an OSS archive for 27 years. In 1972, the friend convinced Berg to accept it, arguing that the medal came with financial benefits. It didn't, really, but the friend exaggerated this to overcome Berg's resistance, and that Berg needed any resources he could get. Berg agreed, finally accepted the medal in a private ceremony, and received a small amount of money that the friend had arranged, not actually connected to the medal, but presented as if it were. This was the only time in his life that Berg accepted recognition for his wartime service, and he did it only because of desperate financial need, not because he had changed his mind about wanting recognition. On May 29, 1972, Berg collapsed on a street in Newark. He was taken to a hospital where doctors determined he had suffered a fall that caused internal injuries. Berg's health had been declining for months, and the fall accelerated his deterioration. Berg's condition worsened over the following days. He was 70 years old, in poor health, with limited financial resources and few family members still alive. The hospital staff treating him had no idea they were caring for a man who had once been a Major League Baseball player and a secret agent who had been prepared to assassinate Werner Heisenberg to prevent Hitler from getting atomic bombs. On May 30, 1972, Morris Berg died in the hospital. His last recorded words, spoken to a nurse who asked how he felt, were characteristically mysterious. How did the Mets do today? This final statement, asking about a baseball game while dying, captured something essential about Berg. Baseball had been his lifelong constant, his connection to normal life, perhaps the only thing he had ever truly cared about, enough to ask about when nothing else mattered. Or perhaps it was a final deflection, a final refusal to engage seriously with the moment. a final joke at the expense of those expecting profound last words. Berg's death received limited attention. Obituaries in major newspapers mentioned his baseball career and noted vaguely that he had worked in intelligence during World War II, but couldn't provide details because much of his work remained classified. The obituaries portrayed Berg as an eccentric, brilliant failure, someone who should have accomplished more, who had wasted his potential, who had ended life in poverty and obscurity. These obituaries were accurate in describing the facts of Berg's life but missed the significance. Berg had accomplished something extraordinary during the war. He had gathered crucial intelligence, had correctly assessed German atomic weapons programs, had helped ensure Allied nuclear superiority. That these accomplishments remained secret, that Berg couldn't discuss them, and consequently couldn't be properly recognized, made his life seem wasted when it actually hadn't been. Berg was buried in a Jewish cemetery in New Jersey. The funeral was small, attended by a handful of remaining friends and distant family members. There was no military ceremony despite his wartime service, no recognition of his intelligence work, no baseball. Dignitaries paying respects to a former major league player. Berg went to his grave as obscurely as he had lived his final decades. But Berg's story didn't end with his death. As OSS records continued to be declassified through the 1970s and 1980s, more information about his wartime service became public. Historians researching OSS operations discovered Berg's role in the Alsos mission, his assessment of Heisenberg, his intelligence work across Europe. In 1975, a book titled Berg, Athlete, Scholar, Spy by Lewis Kaufman, Barbara Fitzgerald, and Tom Sewell was published, providing the first comprehensive account of Berg's life, including his intelligence work. The book revealed Berg's mission to potentially assassinate Heisenberg, his intelligence gathering in Yugoslavia and elsewhere, and his contribution to assessing German atomic programs. The book generated renewed interest in Berg's story. Sports writers who had covered baseball during Berg's playing career wrote retrospective articles about the strange catcher who spoke a dozen languages. Intelligence historians analyzed Berg's contributions to OSS operations. The story of the baseball player who became a spy, who carried a pistol to a physics lecture prepared to commit assassination if necessary, captured public imagination. Through the 1980s and 1990s, Berg's reputation grew from obscure former baseball player to legendary figure who embodied the romantic view of World War II espionage. His story appeared in books about OSS, about the atomic bomb, about unusual figures in baseball history. He became a symbol of the intellectual who served his country in unconventional ways, the athlete who was more than an athlete, the spy who operated on the fringes of conventional intelligence work. In 1996, Berg was inducted into the National Jewish Sports Hall of Fame, recognition for his baseball career, and for being one of the few Jewish athletes of his era who achieved major league success despite pervasive anti-Semitism in professional sports. In 2018, a biographical film, The Catcher Was a Spy, was released, starring Paul Rudd as Berg, bringing his story to even wider audiences. These posthumous recognitions, these attempts to finally honor and explain Berg, would likely have frustrated the real Berg, who had spent his life resisting being defined, categorized, or explained. But they reflected genuine appreciation for a man whose contributions had been important, but who had lived and died without receiving appropriate recognition. The assessment of Berg's wartime intelligence work by historians has been generally positive but nuanced. His role in the Alsos mission was significant but not decisive. He was one of many operatives gathering intelligence on German atomic programs. And while his assessment of Heisenberg was correct, Other intelligence sources reached similar conclusions. His willingness to assassinate Heisenberg, if necessary, demonstrated operational courage and acceptance of moral complexity. Berg was prepared to commit murder to prevent worse outcomes, was willing to sacrifice his own life and freedom if the mission required it. This kind of resolve, this ability to operate in moral gray areas without paralysis, was essential for effective intelligence work. But some historians have noted that Berg's actual intelligence gathering, while competent, wasn't extraordinarily sophisticated. He didn't recruit agents, didn't penetrate enemy organizations, didn't steal crucial documents. He observed, interviewed, assessed, and reported. These were important functions, but they were within the capabilities of many intelligence officers. What made Berg unusual wasn't necessarily exceptional espionage skills, but rather his unique combination of attributes: languages, scientific understanding, cultural sophistication, operational independence, and willingness to work alone on ambiguous missions. This combination was rare and made Berg valuable for specific types of operations that other intelligence officers couldn't conduct as effectively. The question of whether Berg's life was wasted or fulfilled is more complex than simple success-failure binary. By conventional measures, Berg's life after age 43, when he left OSS, was a failure. Unemployed, dependent, isolated, dying in poverty. But Berg himself may have viewed life differently, may have measured success by intellectual engagement, by freedom from conventional constraints, by having done important work during the war even if he couldn't discuss it afterward. One interpretation is that Berg was someone who functioned well in crisis, but poorly in normalcy, who needed the high stakes and unconventional nature of wartime intelligence work to feel purposeful, and who never found peacetime equivalent. This interpretation views Berg sympathetically. He wasn't failing at life. He simply needed conditions that peacetime society couldn't provide. Another interpretation is darker, that Berg was damaged by his wartime experiences, that carrying a pistol to assassinate Heisenberg, that operating under constant stress in life-threatening situations, that maintaining elaborate cover identities and lies, fundamentally altered Berg's ability to function in normal society. This interpretation views Berg's post-war decline as a kind of PTSD, or moral injury, damage that prevented him from ever fully returning to civilian life. A third interpretation emphasizes Berg's lifelong patterns. He had always been strange, always been secretive, always been unable to maintain conventional relationships or employment. The war gave him temporary purpose but didn't fundamentally change who he was. His post-war life was just a continuation of patterns established long before he ever joined OSS. All three interpretations have merit, and the truth probably combines elements of each. Berg was unusual from childhood, found temporary fit during wartime intelligence work, was changed by those experiences, and spent his final decades unable to find purpose or connection in ways that conventional society demanded. The legacy of Mo Berg is complex and multifaceted. In baseball history, he is remembered as the intellectual oddity, the catcher who spoke a dozen languages, the player who proved that athletes could be intelligent and educated even in an era when sports and intellect were considered incompatible. In intelligence history, he is remembered as the baseball player who became a spy, who assessed German atomic programs, who was prepared to assassinate Werner Heisenberg, who contributed to Allied victory in ways that remained secret for decades. In Jewish American history, he is remembered as one of the few Jewish professional athletes of his era who achieved success despite anti-Semitism, who served his country in important ways, who demonstrated that Jewish Americans could excel in athletics and intellect simultaneously. But perhaps Berg's most important legacy is as a reminder that people are complicated, that conventional categories often fail to capture human complexity, that success and failure are less binary than we often assume. Berg was simultaneously brilliant and dysfunctional, heroic and tragic, accomplished and wasted. He spent 15 years in Major League Baseball, despite being overqualified intellectually for the sport. He spent 3 years conducting intelligence work that was genuinely important, despite having no formal training for it. He spent 27 years unemployed and dependent, despite having capabilities that should have enabled comfortable, productive life. He spoke a dozen languages but couldn't communicate basic personal information to people closest to him. He was prepared to assassinate one of history's greatest physicists, but couldn't hold ordinary jobs that required showing up on time. He gathered intelligence that helped win World War II, but died in poverty asking about a baseball score. These contradictions, these paradoxes, make Berg fascinating, but also make him difficult to assess fairly. He doesn't fit neat narratives about heroes or failures, about wasted potential or fulfilled lives, about intelligence work or athletic careers. Perhaps the most appropriate way to remember Mo Berg is simply to acknowledge him as he was, extraordinarily intelligent, deeply strange, genuinely courageous when courage was needed, unable to function in peacetime society, secretive to the point of self-destruction, and ultimately unknowable despite the extensive documentation of his life. The catcher who became a spy, who carried a pistol to a lecture prepared to kill a physicist, if necessary, who correctly assessed that assassination wasn't needed, who contributed to ensuring Allied atomic monopoly, who refused recognition for his work, who spent his final decades in mysterious unemployment, who died asking about a baseball score. That was Morris Mo Berg, Princeton graduate, Major League catcher, OSS spy, polyglot, genius, unemployed enigma, man who was simultaneously one of the most interesting people of his generation, and someone who never quite fit anywhere, whose life was both significant accomplishment and tragic waste, whose story deserves to be told even though Berg himself refused to tell it. His legacy is the questions he raises more than the answers he provides, questions about intelligence and athletics, about secrecy and openness, about service and recognition, about what makes a life successful or wasted, about how we remember people who accomplished important things, but who lived in ways that conventional society considers failures. Mo Berg's Medal of Freedom, which he finally accepted in 1972, only months before his death, is now displayed at the National Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown, New York. It sits among artifacts from his baseball career, his catcher's mitt, photographs of him in uniform, box scores from games he played. The juxtaposition is perfect. The Medal of Freedom earned for intelligence work during World War II, displayed among artifacts from his baseball career, representing a life that spanned multiple worlds but belonged fully to none. Baseball player and spy, athlete and intellectual, hero and enigma, successful and tragic, remembered and misunderstood. That is Mo Berg's legacy. The man who was all of these contradictions simultaneously, who refused to be defined or explained, who contributed significantly to history but remained mysterious, who asked about a baseball score while dying, because even in death he maintained the persona he had constructed over 70 years. The intellectual athlete, the educated player, the cultured spy, The man who spoke a dozen languages but couldn't communicate who he really was. The catcher was a spy. The spy was a mystery. And the mystery remains, decades after his death, as fascinating and impossible to fully understand as Berg was in life.